Have you ever wondered what kind of world it was, where sisters married their brothers not out of love, but duty, where power meant folding yourself into ancient bloodlines, where the walls of the palace whispered not only secrets, but reminders of the sacred incest that held a kingdom together? Perhaps you're listening to this in a quiet moment of your night, lying in bed with the last glow of your phone dimming slowly. Or maybe you've tucked yourself into a soft couch, letting the hum of distant traffic and ceiling fans lull you into a half-dream. If you're new here, please do subscribe to our channel. It helps us bring you more calm stories like this one. And tell us, where are you listening from? US? Cairo? New York? Or maybe you're somewhere timeless, a forgotten hotel near the Nile. Its windows cracked open to let in the dust and the scent of ancient water. Tonight, we're telling a story from that place, a story from the palaces of Ptolemaic Egypt, where Cleopatra VII, one of the most famous women in all of history, was forced by tradition and dynasty to marry her younger brother. Yes, you heard that right. Cleopatra slept with her brother not because she wanted to, not because she loved him, but because her world demanded it. In her kingdom, incest was not taboo. It was sacred. In the beliefs of ancient Egypt, the gods married their siblings, Isis and Osiris, Shu and Tefnut, Nut and Geb. And since the pharaohs believed they were descended from gods, what better way to maintain divine purity than to marry one's blood? The Ptolemies, Greek rulers of Egypt who followed Alexander the Great's conquest, picked up this tradition, not out of religious devotion, but to mimic power, to root themselves in Egyptian legitimacy, and to ensure that no outsider, no courtier, no noble family could challenge the throne. So Cleopatra, at just 18, found herself married to her brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was around 10 years old. He was a child, and she was a woman in waiting for her moment, her mind, her voice. But for now, she had to share a crown, bed, and a country with him. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't even political, not in the modern sense. It was architectural part of the very structure of Egyptian royalty. And yet, beneath this cold, calculated surface, there were tensions. Ptolemy's advisors didn't like Cleopatra's independence. She spoke Egyptian fluently, unusual for the Greek-descended Ptolemies, and she surrounded herself with scholars, generals, and her thoughts. She studied philosophy, medicine, and astronomy. She read Homer and listened to Egyptian priests. And perhaps when she looked at her brother, she didn't see a husband or a god, but a threat, or a child, or simply a delay. It didn't take long before the court split into factions. Cleopatra, exiled. Her brother, elevated. Civil war followed. The same siblings who were meant to rule hand in hand soon stood across a battlefield. And while armies clashed and scrolls burned, and palaces filled with rumor, Cleopatra plotted her return. This time, not as a sister wife, but as a queen alone. And here, soft in the shadows of time, comes a strange twist. Cleopatra sought help from the West. She met Julius Caesar. Yes, that Caesar in one of history's most theatrical entrances. Some say she rolled herself into a carpet and had herself smuggled into his quarters, stepping out with dust in her hair and diplomacy in her smile. Together, they restored her to the throne, and her brother, her husband, was drowned in the Nile, dead at 14. And so ended a marriage that was never really a marriage, only a mirror. But the tradition didn't end there. Cleopatra would later marry another brother, Ptolemy XIV, again out of custom, again without choice. Meanwhile, she gave birth to Caesar's child, named him Caesarion, and ruled beside him as mother and goddess. The world around her was changing, Rome rising, Egypt bending, alliances shifting like the desert winds. Yet at the center of it, all stood a woman who had known since girlhood that to survive meant sacrifice, and to reign meant surrendering even the sanctity of your body to symbols and rituals older than memory. So next time someone tells you that Cleopatra was a seductress, ask instead, what does it mean to be born into a cage of gold, where love is law and the law is blood? And did she ever dream of escaping it all, of rowing away on the Nile in the dark, past the reeds and tombs and temples, into silence? Perhaps you're already drifting into sleep, imagining the quiet ripples of that ancient river. But the true story is just beginning. What happened when Cleopatra met the Romans? What did she do with her second brother husband? And how did she hold an empire in her hand while men waged war around her? Let's drift deeper into that history dot. So now Cleopatra had returned to power. Her young brother husband drowned in the Nile under mysterious circumstances. Some say by accident, others say by silent design, and the woman who had once been exiled was again draped in royal linens and golden crowns, her gaze sharper now, less forgiving, as if the river had whispered something ancient into her ear during her long wait. But the throne of Egypt, under Ptolemaic law, could never be held by one alone, not truly, not in ritual, not in ceremony. So what did Cleopatra do? She married her next youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, a boy of about 12. The tradition resumed. Another brother husband crowned. Another divine pair carved into the temples as Osiris and Isis. The same myth replayed in marble and ink, as though human hearts could be scripted. Cleopatra was now the queen, no longer in exile, but wrapped in the theater of power where her body was the stage. But make no mistake, this new brother was no real threat. He was young, pliable, controlled, and quietly placed on the throne beside her, while the real world spun beyond the palace walls. Cleopatra was already far deeper into the game than he could ever be. Her mind was in Rome, her letters flown across the Mediterranean, her heart perhaps not romantic, but strategic. Julius Caesar had not only restored her to the throne, but he had also visited Egypt, lived in her palace, and sailed with her on the Nile. They dined beneath painted stars on the ceiling, watched plays performed in 3 languages, and debated philosophy with candlelight flickering on the scrolls. She gave birth to his son Caesarion, though Rome refused to name him as such. And here lies another twist. Though Cleopatra married her brother, she bore the child of a Ramang. Her brother was her husband in title only. The bedroom she shared was with Caesar. And yet, for ceremony's sake, for temple priests and public inscriptions, her brother remained the official consort. The boy grew ill, some say neglected, some say poisoned. Years later, like the brother before him, Ptolemy XIV died young, suspiciously so. Cleopatra wept at the funeral, her eyes lowered, her voice calm. But behind the veil, her mind remained, fixed on power, for she now named Caesarion her co-ruler, just a toddler, yet already crowned. Egypt now had a queen and her son as god-king. No more brothers, no more lies wrapped in ceremony. But the outside world had begun to shift. Caesar had been murdered in Rome, stabbed by senators, betrayed by friends, and Cleopatra's golden thread to the empire snapped overnight. When she received the news, some say she did not scream. She walked silently to the window and looked out across the Nile, where boats bobbed under moonlight. Her entire future, shaped by Caesar's favor, was gone. Yet Cleopatra did not crumble. She wrote letters. She studied the political void. And soon, 2 new names rose from the ashes of Rome: Mark Antony and Octavian. The former was firebold, brash, emotional. The latter, ice-calculating, patient, lethal. Cleopatra bet on fire. She summoned Antony to Egypt, dressed not as a widow or a supplicant, but as the goddess Aphrodite, arriving on a barge of purple sails, with silver oars and musicians playing flutes. The air smelled of incense and rose water. Antony, stunned by the spectacle, fell under her spell, or perhaps chose to love? Maybe. Politics? Definitely. Cleopatra and Antony became lovers and allies. He gave her land, ships, and support. She gave him children, twins, and more, and in return, she was declared Queen of Kings. Her son Caesarion declared King of Kings. Statues were raised, coins minted. The Roman world gasped. Octavian fumed. And yet, in the heart of all this grandeur, the strange tradition of brother husband still lingered. Egypt had changed, but not fully. Cleopatra kept her ceremonies intact, her titles plural, her image divine. Though her brothers were gone, she still invoked them in rituals. Even in their deaths, they served her narrative as fallen gods who made way for the new. Some whispered she had both of them poisoned. Others believed they were never more than shadow symbols forced upon her. But the fact remained. In her youth, she had obeyed. She had worn the bridal robes beside boys too. Young to hold a sword, much less a kingdom. She had survived it all, not by breaking the rules, but by playing them until she wrote her own. Still, Cleopatra's story wasn't over. Rome would not tolerate a queen who claimed to birth gods. Octavian, now styled Augustus, prepared for war. Propaganda flowed. He called her a seductress, a witch, a danger to Rome. She, in turn, held banquets, forged alliances, and armed her fleets. The lovers Cleopatra and Antony would make their last stand at the Battle of Actium. But we are not there yet. Let's stay here a little longer, in the quiet palace where marble floors reflect the flicker of oil lamps and whispers hide in the folds of royal linens. Let's walk slowly through a corridor where once a teenage queen held her brother's hand at a wedding no child should ever attend. Let's imagine the moment she stood behind a curtain, hearing priests chant hymns that turned family into fate. Let's wonder, not in judgment, but in awe, what it must have been like to wake up each day and play the goddess, while knowing you were still a girl, her brothers gone, her son crowned, her past sealed in ritual, her future sailing into a storm. And as you close your eyes, maybe you can still hear the water outside her palace soft, patient, ancient, lapping against the stone docks like a lullaby older than history. But the story of Cleopatra is not a lullaby. It is a blade wrapped in silk. And so the winds began to shift gently at first, as if even the forces of fate wished to give Cleopatra a little more time beneath her silk canopy and scented sails. But war has never respected softness for long. Rome was coming. Not the Rome that had sent Julius Caesar with scrolls and negotiation. Not even the Rome that had sent Mark Antony with silver armor and swaggering promises. But the cold Rome of Octavian, the future Augustus, who understood that empire could be built not only with legions, but with stories. And so he began to tell one. Not a true one, but one that sounded true enough. That Cleopatra had bewitched good Roman men, had stolen their loyalty, corrupted their souls, and turned them from marble honor to perfumed decadence. He called her a foreign temptress, a snake, a manipulator who slept her way through Rome's elite. But beneath all that noise was a quieter fear. Cleopatra was a queen who didn't break under pressure. And that was a problem. And now she stood, again, beside a man whose power threatened Rome's fragile balance. Mark Antony and Cleopatra had built a vision of a new East, a world ruled not from a senate, but a throne, not from cold marble columns, but from golden temples and scented scrolls. But visions threaten those who do not dream. So war came slowly, like smoke rising from an unseen fire. Octavian's fleet gathered. Antony's messengers faltered. And Cleopatra? She prepared in her way, not just with ships or soldiers, but with rituals, with final acts of legacy. She proclaimed Caesarion her son with Caesar as the rightful heir, not just of Egypt, but of Rome. It was a move both brilliant and suicidal. Octavian, heir by adoption, could not let the blood son of Caesar rise. It was a challenge to his claim, and challenges were never tolerated. The world narrowed into a single point. Actium, a coastal city where the sea and politics collided. There, in 31 BCE, the forces of Cleopatra and Antony faced Octavian's navy in a strange, theatrical battle that felt less like war and more like opera. Cleopatra, aboard her royal barge, waited behind the lines. Some say she hesitated. Some say the winds betrayed her. Others whisper that she saw, for the first time, the myth of her power beginning to crack. Whatever the reason, her fleet turned and fled. Antony, watching from the deck, abandoned the battle and followed. It was a moment that would be remembered as cowardice, but perhaps it was something else. Love? Desperation? Confusion? The tides don't tell. What we do know is that Actium ended it all. Rome claimed victory. Egypt lost its protector. And Cleopatra returned to Alexandria, her capital, knowing the sands were slipping. There, she made her final preparations. She sealed Caesarion's claim. She sent away loyal aides. She counted what could be burned, what could be saved, and what had already been lost. Antony arrived too, broken, his legions deserting, his reputation shattered. The lovers no longer held a future, only a memory. But still, Cleopatra remained regal. She held court. She made offerings. She lit the temple fires. And she waited. Octavian, when he arrived at Alexandria's gates, didn't storm the city. He paused. Some say he wanted her alive. Others that he hoped to parade her through Rome in chains. Cleopatra would have neither. In a room heavy with incense, with the statues of gods watching and the Nile humming outside like a soft drum, she made her final choice. Perhaps you've heard the story. The asp, the basket of figs, the fatal bite. But history doesn't agree. Some say it was poison hidden in a cone. Others say it was an ointment rubbed into the skin. Some even claim Octavian ordered her killed. We will never know. What we do know is that she died on her terms, in her palace, with her attendants at her side, her body wrapped in fine linen, her eyes painted with kohl, her memory already turning into myth. Antony, learning of her death, took his own life falling on his sword in a Roman gesture of doomed honor. And Caesarion? Captured, executed. Rome erased him. The dynasty ended. The last pharaoh was gone. Egypt became a Roman province. And yet, Cleopatra remained. In paintings, in plays, in stories. But most of those stories stripped her down, turned her into a caricature of seduction, of sin, of feminine threat. Few remembered the girl who married her brother, not out of love but law, who ruled through ritual before she ever tasted power, who was taught to share a throne with a child while plotting the survival of her people. Even fewer recall how she kept the traditions of divine incest, not because she desired them, but because without them, she would have been devoured by men twice her age and half her brilliance. She was born into a cage gilded with the bones of her ancestors, where each choice was shaped by the one before, and her marriages, so disturbing to us, were to her the price of existence. So perhaps it is time to ask a different question. Not why did Cleopatra sleep with her brother, but how did she survive it? How did she twist those chains into scepters? How did she use ancient myths to build her own? And how did a girl from a crumbling Greek line in a foreign land make herself remembered for 2,000 years? As you drift into sleep, you might imagine her one last time, not as a queen or a goddess, not even as a lover, but as a woman standing on the edge of a balcony in Alexandria, looking out at the sea where it all began, wondering not how she would be remembered, but if she would be remembered at all. And even now, as we whisper her name Cleopatra, it echoes not with scandal, but with silence. But the silence is full of history, of ritual, of the strange, soft terror of being royal in a world that eats its young. And so we close her story, but only gently. Because even when the tale ends, the questions stay awake. When Cleopatra's body was laid to rest, her death did not mark the end of a chapter, but the burial of an entire worldview, one where royalty was not only inherited through blood, but kept pure by it, where gods were not distant stars, but family trees carved into temple walls, and where the sacred was often indistinguishable from the uncomfortable. As Octavian stood over the remains of her kingdom, soon to be named Augustus, and declared the first emperor of Rome, he didn't just absorb Egypt as a territory. He absorbed its mythology, its gold, its grain, and its strange but powerful customs. The Ptolemies were no more, but their legacy lingered, haunting the marbled halls of Roman palaces with whispers of incense, sibling thrones, and ancestral marriages. You may think the tradition of brother-sister union ended there, with Cleopatra's final breath, but the truth is more nuanced, more layered, like the folds of linen that wrapped the bodies of the dead, soft, complex, and full of silence. Even as Rome discredited her in life, it borrowed from her in death. Augustus was careful with Cleopatra's memory. He destroyed her image in Roman propaganda, yet preserved Egyptian temples that bore her likeness. Why? Perhaps because Egypt needed to remain useful, not defiant, not ashamed, but quietly reverent. And so, the statues stayed, the priests continued their rituals, and Cleopatra's story was rewritten not by poets, but by power. In the centuries that followed, the memory of incestuous royal unions was not buried, but romanticized, exoticized, and misunderstood. Ancient historians debated whether the Ptolemies were cruel or just consistent. Medieval chroniclers turned Cleopatra into a cautionary tale, a woman too beautiful, too ambitious, too willing to blur the line between intimacy and governance. Renaissance painters revived her image as a seductress with serpents in her lap, but few paused to understand the cage she was born into, the reasons her ancestors had slept with their siblings long before she ever spoke her first word. And what of those ancestors? The Ptolemaic dynasty was founded by Ptolemy I, one of Alexander the Great's generals, a Macedonian who took Egypt like a prize, but married into its symbolism like a careful actor. He declared himself pharaoh, not because he was born one, but because it helped him hold a kingdom fractured by culture and memory. His descendants followed suit, generation after generation, marrying sisters, daughters, and cousins to prevent the intrusion of outside bloodlines, to keep the divine cycle spinning. It was politics disguised as piety, and in many ways, it worked. For 300 years, but the cost was high. The royal family tree didn't grow. It curled inward, like a snake eating its tail. Madness, paranoia, betrayal, and endless palace intrigue flourished. Brothers poisoned brothers, sisters plotted coups, mothers manipulated sons, and children learned that to love a sibling might also mean to fear them. Cleopatra was born at the tail end of that spiral, a girl raised in golden halls with blood-stained floors. She watched uncles vanish, cousins disappear, and siblings transformed into spouses with the cold logic of tradition. What did she dream of, this last pharaoh? Did she imagine a world where love was not assigned by lineage, where power was not extracted from kinship, but from character? We cannot know, but we can walk with her softly through the echoing halls of her past. Picture her as a child, perhaps 7 or 8, learning to read hieroglyphs beside a brother destined to be her husband. The scrolls would speak of Osiris and Isis, of divine love that transcended mortal logic, and the priests would nod solemnly, reminding her that she too was divine, and that divinity comes with duties. She would smile, perhaps, unaware of the weight behind those words. But time has a way of peeling innocence from even the most sacred scripts. Later, in her adolescence, she would attend ceremonies where siblings stood hand in hand, garlanded, in lotus and draped in linen, while crowds cheered their union. She would watch the faces of queens before her, stone-faced, unreadable, and wonder whether they had ever loved or only ruled. By the time her turn came, she was ready, or at least she pretended to be. The marriage to her first brother was not celebrated with joy, but with ritual precision. She was praised not for passion, but for obedience. And as she walked through columns toward the throne, she may have already begun building a plan. Cleopatra's genius was not that she broke the rules, but that she followed them so well, the world assumed she believed in them until it was too late. She mastered languages, diplomacy, mathematics, and metaphysics. She charmed Caesar, survived Antony, and even in death refused to become a trophy. But through it all, she carried with her the invisible script of her ancestry: to marry within, to reign as a living deity, to surrender her personal life to the public altar. Imagine the loneliness of that. Not the loneliness of a widow or of exile, but of a girl who knew from birth that love would always be ceremonial. Her palace was full of people: musicians, scholars, eunuchs, diplomats. But who could speak to her as a woman, not as a goddess? When her brothers died, did she mourn them as siblings, or shed ritual tears as consorts? Did she remember playing in palace gardens with them before the priests told her they were her destiny? We often forget that Cleopatra was human. That beneath the eyeliner and the marble busts, there was skin, pulse, breath. That she may have once whispered secrets into the shoulder of a sister, or watched the stars from her balcony and wondered what life might have been like if she'd been born. Commoner, anonymous, untouched by ceremony. And yet, she never ran. She never renounced the crown. She wore her roles: sister, wife, queen, mother, like armor woven from silk and prophecy. And perhaps that's what makes her story so haunting. Not the incestuous marriages themselves, strange as they are to us now, but the way she endured them with such calm grace, such strategic brilliance, such aching solitude. And as you drift now, eyes half closed, body warm beneath your blanket, let the image of her fade slowly, not in flames or scandal, but in softness. Picture her walking, barefoot through her library at dawn, scroll in hand, listening to the morning birds, alone but not broken. The last pharaoh, both prisoner and priestess of her bloodline, reminds us that history is never simple, and that even the most disturbing traditions are often stitched into the fabric of survival. But of course, we are not finished. One more layer remains. For the story of Cleopatra's bloodline and the strange web of sibling marriage, divine claims, and collapsing empires did not begin with her. It began long before. Shall we return to the beginning? To truly understand why Cleopatra married her brothers, and why this wasn't simply a scandal, but a system, we must walk far backward in time, long before Cleopatra's birth, long before Rome, long before even the Greek conquest of Egypt. We must drift into the misted chambers of Egypt's earliest dynasties, where the pharaohs first declared themselves gods, and where the Nile's flooding rhythms whispered to the reeds of eternity. And bloodlines. You see, in ancient Egypt, power wasn't a thing you acquired. It was a force you inherited, like breath or sunlight or time. And to dilute it with foreign hands was to insult the gods themselves. The pharaoh, often styled as the living Horus, wasn't just a king. He was the sky, the storm, the divine made flesh. And what could be more fitting than for the goddess to marry her god brother, just as Isis married Osiris, and their union birthed the land? So the earliest pharaohs took their sisters as wives, not in secrecy, not in shame, but as sacred ordained unions meant to mirror cosmic order. These weren't love stories. They were rituals carved in stone, temples across Egypt preserved, the names of such divine couples, written in cartouche, presented as harmonious duos guarding Mat, the principle of universal balance. Even as generations passed, the tradition held. And when foreign dynasties arrived, Hyksos, Libyans, Nubians, they either disrupted or adopted this model, depending on how badly they wished to appear legitimate in Egyptian eyes. But it wasn't until Alexander the Great's arrival that a true transformation began. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE, his generals scrambled for control. One of them, Ptolemy, took Egypt not just as a military post, but as a personal kingdom. And in a shrewd political move, he began adopting the titles of pharaoh while maintaining Greek customs at court. His descendants, the Ptolemies, would continue this balancing act, Greek in language and blood, Egyptian in ceremony and appearance. And because they feared outside interference, and because they knew how fragile their claim was in the eyes of the Egyptian people, they revived the ancient custom of sibling marriage, not out of desire, but necessity. The Ptolemies began marrying sisters, nieces, and daughters. Cleopatra came from centuries of this practice. Her family tree was more like a wreath, circular, closed, and tightly bound. Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoe too, and even gave her the title of Philadelphus, meaning sibling-loving. The people praised it as a divine imitation, though Greek observers abroad often cringed. And yet, no one stopped it. This blending of divine lineage and royal security became so normal that by Cleopatra's time, marrying your brother wasn't even discussed. It was expected. But what did that look like in real life? Imagine the palace. Stone walls covered in painted lotus blooms, long colonnades where peacocks walked slowly under palm-shaded gardens, and at the center, a family trying to preserve 1,000-year-old illusion. Cleopatra may have studied with tutors from Athens, but her mornings still began with offerings to Ra. Her body may have been perfumed with Greek oils, but her crown bore the twin cobras of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her thoughts may have been modern, but her throne was ancient. And the brothers she married? They were raised not as siblings with shared games or casual dinners, but as ritual reflections of the divine masculine, a role they did not always accept with grace. Ptolemy XIII, her first husband-brother, was just a boy when their political alliance was formalized. And as we've seen, their reign ended not with a coronation, but with civil war. Ptolemy XIV, her second brother-husband, was similarly young, and ultimately died under suspicious circumstances. These unions were often cold, strategic, and short-lived, but that did not make them meaningless. They were symbolic necessary chess moves in a game where losing meant death or exile. Cleopatra understood this better than anyone, and so she played the part standing beside her child husband during ceremonies, lifting cups during rituals, presenting herself as both queen and consort, even as she quietly maneuvered her real ambitions elsewhere. Her reign was a tapestry of contradictions, public devotion and private distance, sacred intimacy and political avoidance. And in these contradictions lived her strength. But the world was watching. The Roman writers, many of them hostile, many more confused, could not make sense of these customs. To them, marrying a brother was the ultimate taboo. So when Cleopatra's story reached their ears, they rewrote it. They erased the sacred and magnified the strange. They called her immoral, perverse, and manipulative. They cast her not as a ruler working within ancient norms, but as a temptress bending those norms to her will. The truth, of course, was more delicate. Cleopatra was born into a system she didn't design, but had to survive. And within that system, she turned symbols into shields. If marrying her brother kept her on the throne, then she would marry him. If calling herself Isis reincarnated gave her authority, then she would wear the cobra crown and walk barefoot into the temples with rose petals in her path. She was pragmatic, not perverse, and the people loved her for it. In Alexandria, she funded libraries, hosted philosophers, fed the poor during famine, and maintained peace in a time of global tremor. To her people, she was not the sister wife. They barely used those terms. She was the queen, and that was enough. And what of the emotional cost? We may never fully grasp it. Did she ever long for a marriage made of choice? Did she lie awake in her chamber with a sleeping child king beside her and wonder what life might feel like if love were not ceremonial? Perhaps, or perhaps she had trained herself not to feel such things. Power numbs. Ritual anesthetizes. And when you're told from birth that your worth is bound to your brothers, your body stops asking questions. But still, in quiet moments, perhaps while watching the moon slip through her garden's water channels, or while listening to the distant lull of oars on the Nile, maybe something in her ached. Not for freedom, but for normalcy. And now, as you listen somewhere between waking and sleeping, you might begin to understand how survival in ancient Egypt was never just about lineage. It was about performance. Cleopatra survived because she was the best performer of all. But the final act is still to come. What happens when tradition becomes a trap? When sacred marriage turns into a scandal? When gods are forgotten and history replaces divinity with drama? Let's float forward gently to that final unraveling. Even as Cleopatra's name passed from temple inscriptions to Roman scrolls, from the stone-carved sanctuaries of Upper Egypt to the smoky wine-soaked chatter of Roman taverns, the echo of her life, so intertwined with the tradition of sibling marriage, kept twisting quietly beneath the surface, like a ribbon in deep water. Most who spoke of her after her death did not speak of her as a scholar, or a ruler, or a savior of grain during famine. They spoke of her as a woman who slept with her brother. They did not understand the ritual, the symbolism the cage made, of marble and gold. They saw only a taboo reflected through their cultural lens. But what happens when a tradition, once sacred and unchallenged, begins to fray? By Cleopatra's time, even in Egypt, the old divine justifications for sibling marriage had started to wear thin among intellectuals. Alexandria, her capital, was a city of contradictions, Egyptian in symbol, Greek in tongue, Roman in shadow. The temples still conducted ceremonies in honor of Isis and Osiris. Yes, but outside those sanctuaries, philosophers debated in stoas. Mathematicians wrote proofs in sand, and foreign traders laughed over dates and dried fish in 5 different languages. It was a city where ideas rubbed against each other like flint. So imagine Cleopatra walking barefoot through her palace library, possibly the last in Egypt to still house priests and astronomers under the same ceiling. Scrolls of Homer sat beside scrolls of Imhotep. Greek astronomers argued quietly with Egyptian sky priests about the movement of Sirius. Even as the rituals of royal incest continued in public, there were whispers behind every curtain. Was this still sacred? Or simply convenient? Or even dangerous? For Cleopatra, there was no luxury of academic distance. The rituals were not theoretical. They were political survival. And in that space, where the divine met the pragmatic, Cleopatra played her most difficult role. She had to present herself to the people as the eternal goddess reborn Isis, sister wife to a pharaoh god, while simultaneously convincing foreign diplomats that she was a rational monarch, well-read in Aristotle, fluent in 9 languages, and capable of governing a multicultural empire. She couldn't afford for Rome to think of her as too Egyptian, nor could she afford for Egypt to see her as too Roman. The compromise was exhausting. And into this careful balancing act entered Julius Caesar, a man who at first may have seemed like a golden escape hatch, a foreign ally, a lover not bound by siblinghood, a father to a child who might represent a future beyond the Ptolemaic spiral. But even this break from tradition required tradition's help. While Cleopatra shared her bed with Caesar, she still married her second brother, Ptolemy XIV, in a public ceremony. The marriage was necessary, not as a relationship, but as a performance for the temple priests, the grain officials, the old generals still loyal to her father's reign. To discard it would be to shake the foundation of Egyptian perception. And so, once again, the sacred marriage was conducted. The boy was young. The woman was in control. And again, within a few years, the brother husband was dead. And again, no trial, no evidence, only a subtle shift in palace routine, his name removed from documents, his image softened on the coins, and a new co-ruler named Caesarion, her son with Caesar, half Roman, half Egyptian, neither divine by birth, yet called divine by decree. But what of the people? How did the Egyptians feel about all of this? Were they still devoted to the idea of sibling marriage, or had the symbolism worn out its shape? The answer lies in silence. No records of revolt. No letters of outrage. Only continued tax records, temple donations, and songs sung during festivals. The people may have been curious. They may have questioned, but they did not rebel. For them, as long as the Nile rose, and the bread arrived, and the festivals were funded, the crown could be worn by whomever the gods chose or whomever the queen named. Still, beneath that public calm, there must have been murmurings. Scribes who paused before writing husband and brother. Scholars who hesitated before explaining the rites of divine union to foreign guests. Priests who remembered older times before the Ptolemies, when Egypt was ruled by men whose families were not folded in on themselves. But none of these hesitations reached the surface. Cleopatra remained queen. Her child grew, and the last remnants of sibling rule remained alive, not in the embrace of two lovers, but in the structure of law. But what about her own heart? Did Cleopatra mourn the loss of her brothers, or simply the function they represented? Did she sit in her garden, among lotus and incense, and feel the weight of having outlived them all? Or had she long since replaced familial grief with statecraft? Perhaps there was no distinction for her. After all, to rule in Egypt was to absorb the personal into the political, the emotional into the divine. A queen's warning was a state event. A brother's death was a policy shift. Love was not a private matter. It was a script to be enacted in public ceremony. Yet there is something quietly tragic about this model. To be bound by rituals so tightly that one's body ceases to belong to the self. Cleopatra was not allowed the luxury of love. She was allowed roles: sister, wife, queen, goddess, diplomat, mother, but not lover, not in her name. Even her most famous romances with Caesar, with Antony, were tangled with strategy, with war, with optics. And so, perhaps the truest tragedy of sibling marriage in her world was not that it was disturbing, but that it was empty. A gesture, a reenactment, a symbol whose original meaning had decayed, leaving only the shape behind. Like a mask worn so long that the skin beneath begins to forget it was ever bare. And yet, even now, centuries later, we still speak of it. Not because of the marriages themselves, but because of her. Because Cleopatra endured them, and rose through them, and became something larger than the system that produced her. As you listen now, your eyes soft, your breath even, perhaps you feel a strange empathy, not for the royal traditions, but for the girl beneath the crown. The one who may have once whispered to herself in the dark, "I will survive this too." But, of course, survival was only half the story. The next part, how it all unraveled, is something else entirely. By the time Cleopatra named Caesarion as her co-ruler, placing the small child, barely able to speak in full sentences, Upon a throne carved with stories older than writing itself, the fabric of sibling marriage, once a proud divine thread of Egyptian royalty, had frayed into something quieter, more ceremonial, and more empty. The title King of Kings was given to her son, not because he came from her brother's blood, but because he was Caesar's, and yet, to the priests and the people, she still performed the role of divine continuity, as if nothing had changed. And perhaps that was Cleopatra's greatest illusion, to make change look like tradition, and tradition feel like destiny. But behind the golden doors of Alexandria's palace, a storm had already begun to brew. Caesar was dead. Rome was fractured. Octavian, the adopted heir of Caesar, had begun a long and deliberate campaign to claim power, not only over Italy, but over every corner of the Roman world. And Cleopatra, in her palace of incense and silks, was no longer a distant symbol. She was now an obstacle. For Octavian, Caesarion's very existence was a threat. If Caesar's biological son ruled Egypt, what would stop him from claiming Rome one day? Blood had power, even in a world ruled by steel. So Cleopatra needed an ally, and fast. Mark Antony arrived like a firebrand, bold and theatrical, a general, more interested in charisma than caution, a man who viewed the East not with suspicion, but with wonder. He accepted Cleopatra's invitations, dined in her gardens, drank with her philosophers, and within weeks their names were being whispered together across the empire. To Rome, it was a scandal. To Egypt, it was a strategy. Cleopatra was no longer bound by her Ptolemaic brothers, both dead now, their tombs quiet. She was with Antony, not by law, but by choice. And yet, even here, the old patterns lingered. The twins she bore him, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were presented not merely as children of two powerful rulers, but as semi-divine heirs, bearing names that echoed the sun and the moon. And their titles, when announced in ceremonies, bore an eerie resemblance to those once given to her brother husbands. King of Armenia, Queen of Cyrenaica, small bodies dressed in royal linens, made to stand before crowds and nod silently, while scribes recorded their presence like omens. In many ways, Cleopatra had replaced one kind of sacred pairing with another, this time not sibling marriage, but dynastic multiplication, children as extensions of will, blood as empire. Even as she fell deeper into her alliance with Antony, the symbolic machinery of divine rule did not stop. And behind it all, Rome watched, with sharpened knives and colder hearts. Octavian's propaganda machine began to spin. Cleopatra was no longer a queen, she was a witch. No longer a goddess, she was a foreign threat. Scrolls and speeches flooded the Senate halls. Antony had been bewitched, poisoned, emasculated. He was no longer Roman. He had become Egyptian. And Egypt, to Rome, was not just a place, it was a symbol of softness, of excess, of rituals and perfumes and incestuous lines. The stories Octavian spread were cruelly simple. Antony had abandoned his Roman wife for a serpent queen who slept with her brothers. Truth was irrelevant. The imagery stuck. The people stirred. And war came, not with a single trumpet blast, but with months of preparation. The Battle of Actium, as it came to be called, was less a clash of civilizations and more a slow unraveling. Antony's ships, many funded by Cleopatra's treasury, met Octavian's navy in the blue waters of the Ionian Sea. Cleopatra herself was there, on her barge, sails purple, crew loyal, eyes unwavering. But the winds betrayed them, or perhaps it was fate. The tides turned literally and politically, and Cleopatra's fleet began to retreat. Antony followed. The battle was lost, and with it, the future they had built. But this was not yet the end. Back in Alexandria, Cleopatra did not collapse. She regrouped. She fortified. She returned to the sacred spaces, the temples, the treasury, the halls of ceremony, and began rehearsing her last performance. She conducted rites. She reaffirmed Caesarion's role. She wrapped herself once more in the cloak of divine lineage, praying perhaps that the image of Isis could protect her one last time. But Octavian was coming, and he did not believe in gods. When he reached the gates of Alexandria, the city did not resist. The army was gone. The people were quiet. Antony, broken and humiliated, took his life with a Roman sword. And Cleopatra? She dressed in her finest robes, adorned herself with jewels once worn by queens who married their brothers and ruled from gilded thrones, and sealed herself in a chamber with her most loyal handmaidens. The story of the asp, that small, deadly serpent hidden in a basket of figs, has survived not because it's certain, but because it's poetic. Whether it was venom or poison or something else entirely, what mattered was this: Cleopatra chose her ending. She was not paraded through Rome. She was not mocked in chains. She died as she had lived, half myth, half woman. But what of Caesarion? Her son, her last connection to power, was captured and killed on Octavian's orders. With him, the bloodline ended. The line of sacred marriage, begun centuries ago with gods and pharaohs, closed with the quiet execution of a boy who never ruled. Egypt was annexed. The temples fell silent. Rome triumphed. And yet, 2,000 years later, we still speak her name. Cleopatra. Not because she was perfect, but because she endured the unbearable. She lived a life of contradictions, bore the weight of ritual marriages, performed divine roles written by ancestors she never met, and turned each into a stepping stone across history's most treacherous river. Her story is not about incest. It is about survival in a system where incest was the law. And now, as you lie still, breathing slowly, eyes soft in the hush of your room, let your mind drift not toward judgment, but toward understanding, toward the strange stillness of a queen who walked alone through halls, once filled with the voices of brothers made husbands, sons made gods, and lovers made war. And wonder, perhaps, what she would whisper if she could speak to you now, not from a throne, but from a quiet garden under moonlight. And still, the story is not finished, for the echoes of her choices lingered far longer than her crown. Long after Cleopatra had taken her final breath behind the sealed chamber doors of her palace, whether by asp or poison, or some unrecorded final trick, her memory did not die with her. It began to grow, but not always in ways she would have recognized or desired. The Rome that absorbed Egypt under Octavian's new imperial regime did more than conquer territory. It inherited myths, fragments, whispers of old customs too strange to forget and too scandalous to fully explain. Cleopatra, stripped of her titles and kingdom, became a symbol in Rome's imagination. The Eastern queen who slept with her brothers, seduced their generals, and dared to claim the heavens in the name of her bloodline. But the truth, as always, was quieter, heavier, and more human. You see, after her death, Octavian, now Augustus, did not raze the Egyptian temples to the ground. Quite the opposite. He preserved them. He allowed the rituals to continue, the priesthoods to remain intact, the festivals to echo through the streets of Thebes and Memphis. Why? Because Augustus was not only a conqueror, he was a politician. And politicians understand that people do not abandon beliefs merely because a flag changes color. The cult of Isis remained active. The ancient scribes continued recording omens and rainfall, crop rotations, and temple repairs. Statues of divine pharaohs, often carved beside their sisters and wives, were not toppled. They were merely left to gather dust. The tradition of sibling marriage, however, ended with Cleopatra. Not officially, not with a decree, but with silence. There would be no more brother kings. No more thrones shared between child siblings under perfumed canopies. A sacred logic of bloodline purity had run its course. What had once been seen as divine was now viewed, at least in Roman eyes, as decadent, foreign, even dangerous. And so it faded. But just because something disappears doesn't mean it vanishes. The memory of these unions, strange, ritualized, both powerful and tragic, remained embedded in the walls, the papyri, and the whispered teachings of those few who still walk the old temple corridors. Scholars from later centuries, reading fragmentary accounts and squinting at faded inscriptions, would debate endlessly whether Cleopatra truly believed in the gods she invoked, or if she simply performed belief as a political necessity. They debated whether she loved her brothers or merely used them, whether she was a product of her time or a manipulator of it. But they missed something softer, something often overlooked. Cleopatra may have ruled through ritual, yes, and survived, by embracing the architecture of an incestuous dynasty. But that does not mean she was untouched by the strange emotional erosion that such rituals must have brought. Imagine her walking through her childhood chambers, long after her brothers were dead. The same marble floor tiles, the same wall hangings, but no shared laughter, only memory. Were there moments, perhaps, when the silence in the palace grew too large? When even the oil lamps seemed to flicker not with warmth, but with absence? Perhaps she would pause before a door she once knocked on as a girl before ceremony, turned a sibling into a symbol, and wonder what path might have been hers had she been born a baker's daughter, or a shepherd's sister, or no one at all. And yet, she carried it all with a grace so complete that it disguised the fracture underneath. Her legacy, paradoxically, outlasted her empire. In the centuries after her death, as Christianity spread through the Roman world, Cleopatra's name was often invoked not as a queen, but as a warning. Early Christian writers condemned her as an idol worshiper, a sorceress, a woman who dared to place herself in the roles of gods. Some aimed at her marriages, calling them unnatural. Others mocked the Egyptian rituals she preserved. And yet, there was fascination woven through their contempt. Even in rejection, her image shimmered. Even in erasure, she remained. Meanwhile, in Egypt itself, the temples grew quieter. Roman governors ruled now, and though they allowed the old forms to continue, they gave them no power. The pharaoh had been more than a king. He had been the link between heaven and earth, between the Nile and the sky. And without a divine ruler on the throne, that link had broken. Sibling marriage had never been about love. It had been about sealing the divine circuit. With no pharaoh, no goddess queen, no brother king to close the circle, the rites turned hollow. One by one, they were abandoned, but the architecture remained. Statues of couple siblings, spouses, rulers stood, side by side in the courtyards of abandoned sanctuaries, gazing forward with eyes that did not blink. In Alexandria, the city that once held the greatest library on earth, echoes of Cleopatra's court lingered in crumbling colonnades. The scrolls were lost. The banquets ended. But still, somewhere beneath layers of earth and sea salt, the stones remembered centuries past. Cleopatra's story was rewritten again and again by Romans, Christians, medieval monks, Renaissance artists, Enlightenment skeptics, and modern filmmakers. In each retelling, her role shifted. Sometimes a villain, sometimes a seductress, sometimes a feminist icon, but rarely a daughter of ritual. Rarely did a woman caught in the machinery of sacred marriage expect to embody a goddess while still learning how to be human. The truth is far stranger and softer. Cleopatra did not choose to be born into a dynasty that married its own blood. She did not choose to become queen at 18. She did not ask for her brothers to be her husbands. These were not choices, they were inheritances. And yet, she made something powerful out of them. She turned the expected into the exceptional, the ceremony into strategy, the prison into performance. And when finally the curtain fell, she exited, not with screams, but with silence. A silence that still stretches across centuries. As you drift deeper now, your body relaxed, your thoughts curling like incense smoke, perhaps you feel the weight of her world, not just its grandeur or its scandal, but its burden. The heavy crown of ritual, the tight bonds of blood, the thrones that were never as comfortable as they looked. But even now, the story isn't finished. For sibling marriage in Egypt was never just about one queen. It was a structure, a belief, a reflection of the gods themselves. And to fully understand how it endured, and how it was finally unraveled, we must go even further back to the very first pharaohs who dared to marry their sisters not out of desire, but out of divine duty. Before Cleopatra ever stood beneath the temple ceilings painted with stars, before the sandals of her brothers echoed in the palace corridors of Alexandria, before the Ptolemies arrived with their Greek tongues and imported rituals, there were others, earlier kings, older queens, names eroded by sand, yet etched deep into the bedrock of Egyptian memory, who began the tradition of royal sibling marriage, not as scandal, but as sanctity. To understand why, we must return not to Cleopatra's Egypt, but to Egypt's Egypt, to the Old Kingdom. Around 2600 BCE, when pyramids still smelled of fresh-cut limestone, and the word pharaoh had only just begun to take shape. In these earliest dynasties, when gods and rulers blurred at the horizon of belief, marriage between siblings was considered the divine template. It was not simply about keeping bloodlines pure or securing dynastic control. It was about embodying cosmic balance. The most sacred pair in Egyptian mythology, Isis and Osiris, were not only husband and wife, they were brother and sister. Their union symbolized completeness, two halves of a single divine essence. Osiris represented order and resurrection, and Isis represented protection and fertility. Together, they mirrored the world's sacred rhythm, death and life, structure, and emotion, permanence, and flow. So when early Egyptian kings claimed descent from the gods, it was not enough to be powerful. They had to behave as the gods did. And that meant marrying their sisters, not out of lust, but out of liturgical necessity. These marriages were not secret. They were declared in inscriptions, recorded in temple reliefs, and celebrated during festivals. A pharaoh's sister wife was often crowned queen, not just by marriage, but by sacred design. She was a vessel for Hathor, for Mat, for divine femininity itself. And though many of these marriages did not involve romantic intimacy, often they were symbolic, formal, or left unconsummated, they held immense political and spiritual weight. The idea was simple but profound. If the royal family could maintain divine equilibrium within itself, the kingdom would follow suit. If the pharaoh and his sister wife reigned in harmony, so too would the Nile flood in balance, the crops grow, the sun rise cleanly over the desert's edge. But as centuries passed, the sacred clarity of these unions began to tangle with power politics. The line between ritual and control blurred. Sometimes, pharaohs married half-sisters, nieces, even daughters, to keep the lineage tightly bound. While these unions continued to be wrapped in mythological justification, they also served practical ends. They kept wealth in the family, prevented rival noble houses from gaining influence, and secured thrones against factional rebellion. By the time the new kingdom arrived famous for names like Hatshepsut, Akhenaten, and Tutankhamun, the tradition was fully woven into the expectations of rule. Take Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh who attempted to overthrow Egypt's polytheism in favor of a single sun god, Aten. He married his sister Nefertiti or perhaps his cousin or half-sister. depending on which scholar you ask, not only to reinforce his claim to divine reform, but to recreate the original divine pair in a new theological age. Even his successors, like Tutankhamun, followed suit. Tut's wife, Ankhesenamun, was likely his half-sister. Their union, solemn and strange, was part of the larger machine of dynastic symbolism that reached back to the very beginning of kingship. And yet, beneath the ritual, there were human costs. Archaeological evidence suggests that by the time of Tutankhamun, the effects of generational inbreeding club feet, scoliosis, fragile immune systems had begun to manifest. The line was thinning. The god's design had unintended consequences. But in a world ruled by ritual, such signs were often interpreted not as a biological warning, but as a spiritual burden. A frail body might be seen as a vessel for greater divine insight or punishment for sins buried too deep to name. And the practice continued. Even when dynasties shifted, even when foreign powers loomed, Egypt returned again and again to its model of divine sibling rule, until the Greeks came. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he adopted the pharaoh's titles, but brought with him the logic of the Macedonian monarchy. His general Ptolemy, who seized Egypt after Alexander's death, understood the importance of performance. Though Greek by birth, he ruled like an Egyptian pharaoh, allowing temples to operate, rituals to continue, and priests to chant the old names. But he also brought a Greek skepticism of divine marriage. For the first generation or two, the Ptolemies avoided sibling unions. But as their Greek identity clashed with Egyptian expectations, they adapted. Gradually, politically. Suddenly, Ptolemy II married his full sister Arsinoe too, and from that point forward, the Ptolemaic dynasty fully embraced the old Egyptian model, not out of belief, but because it worked. It silenced opposition, preserved royal control, and painted them in the divine hues their subjects recognized. Cleopatra was born at the far end of that line. She inherited the results of centuries of ritual, the good, the bad, and the unspeakable. By her time, sibling marriage was less about belief and more about inertia. A tradition so old, so baked into the bricks of the palace and the breath of the priests, that to remove it would risk unraveling the illusion of sacred kingship. And so she married her brothers, not because she loved them, not because she needed them, but because the throne required it, because the gods demanded it, or so the script read. And perhaps this is the deepest strangeness of all, that a practice designed to mirror harmony, to echo the balance of the stars, could create such quiet sorrow in the hearts of those bound by it. As you rest now, eyes heavy, let your thoughts wander through those early dynastic halls, where stone walls bear the names of husbands and wives who once played together as children. Let your breath slow as you imagine the chill of alabaster floors, the scent of incense before dawn, and the strange, soft voice of a priest reminding a teenage queen that her brother is also her destiny. But the old world always cracks, eventually. And what happened when it did? When the rituals stopped working and the gods fell silent? That, too, is part of her story. When the gods began to fall silent, they did so without thunder or rebellion. No lightning split the temples, no statues wept blood, no sudden eclipse cloaked the Nile in darkness. Rather, their silence crept in like early morning mist, soft and gradual, almost kind. It began with the pauses in ritual, the offerings missed, the priests delayed, the hymns shortened from hours to minutes. Then came the disrepair. A step in the sanctuary cracked and was not replaced. The columns, once repainted every season, grew pale. The ink of scribes dulled. And yet the people still bowed, still nodded, still whispered their names. Osiris, Isis, Horus, though their voices sounded like memory instead of belief. And amid this gentle unraveling stood Cleopatra, the last pharaoh, walking the halls of a palace that had been polished for rituals whose meaning even she, perhaps, no longer fully understood. She continued the ceremonies. Of course, to cease them entirely would have been too sharp a wound. She lit the incense. She honored the calendar. She married her brother, as expected. She carved her names in cartouches beside theirs, sealed her motherhood with royal oaths, and dressed her children in linen dyed in the old colors lapis, ochre, crushed rose. But the rituals had changed. They no longer felt like divine command. They felt like theater. She was the lead actress in a play with no audience, reciting lines written by ancestors whose language had shifted, whose gods no longer lived in the stars, but in the shadows of marble. Still, she endured, because ritual was safety. Ritual was identity, even when it ceased to be faith. And while Rome loomed larger, its laws colder, its logic unyielding, Cleopatra wrapped herself tighter in the cloth of old Egypt, as if by doing so she could slow the erosion. But erosion does not beg for permission. It only waits. It waits. The fading of the sibling marriage, custom so central to Egyptian royal life for 3,000 years, did not occur in a single generation. It frayed over time like the threads of a well-used sash. Even before the Ptolemies, there had been exceptions. Pharaohs who married outsiders or ruled alone. But such choices were rare and always justified by divine visions or political emergency. The expected form remained the same. God king, God queen, blood united to mimic the cosmos. And yet, the world changed. Trade routes multiplied. Greek philosophy arrived with questions, doubts, and dissections. Astronomy shifted from astrology. Medicine became a matter of tools, not prayers. And in such a world, the idea of marrying one's sister no longer inspired reverence. It inspired confusion, or worse, mockery. But Egypt held on longer than most civilizations might have. It had always done so. It had survived the Hyksos, the Libyans, the Assyrians, and the Persians. And each time it had emerged still itself, full of gods and order and mat. So why not one more time? Why not preserve the sacred marriage, even if the gods had stopped answering? Why not continue to crown the brother beside the sister, even if they shared nothing but lineage? Cleopatra's world was one of performance, and the performance of sacred siblinghood, despite its contradictions, its sadness, its slow decay, was part of that necessary illusion. But performance has its limits. And as Octavian's Rome pressed closer, the rituals grew thinner. The final sacred marriage, Cleopatra's to her youngest brother, Ptolemy XIV, was one of gesture, not substance. He was a boy. She, a queen. Their bond was ink on scrolls, not affection in the night. When he died, perhaps poisoned, perhaps quietly set aside, no one wept publicly. No long mourning rites, just a shift in titles. Caesarion, her son with Caesar, rose to co-regency. And the cycle of divine sibling marriage, so long preserved, quietly ended. There would be no more godbrothers, no more thrones shared by children born of the same womb. Cleopatra had, in effect, closed the book, not with rebellion, but with soft transition. A new chapter had begun, one defined by Rome, by foreign blood, by sons instead of brothers. But the echoes of that long tradition still lived in the architecture. Around her, temples still bore images of Horus and Isis. Scribes still copied myths in which sister love created the universe. And perhaps Cleopatra, walking alone some evenings, would place her hand on the carved stone where a queen once stood beside, her royal sibling, and wonder whether the myth had ever really belonged to them, or if it had always been just a mirror. For human loneliness, the gods had demanded union, harmony, shared rule, But had they considered grief? Had they anticipated what it would mean for real people to embody divine roles designed by stars instead of hearts? Cleopatra bore that burden quietly, and though she claimed titles like New Isis and led ceremonies where her children stood like figurines beneath the sun, it is not hard to imagine that part of her longed, deeply and silently, for something unrecorded love unassigned, identity unperformed. Yet she never broke character. To the very end, she wore the script like a second skin, and maybe that is why she endures, because she kept playing her part until the theater burned down around her. And as you lie still now, your thoughts drifting, like soft silt beneath the Nile, perhaps you feel it the weight of rituals that outlive meaning. The strange beauty of stories we continue to tell even after we've stopped believing them. But there's still more. While Cleopatra's marriages have ended, the memory of them did not fade with her crown. It would ripple outward into Rome, into myth, into centuries of fascination. After Cleopatra's death, the palace grew quiet, not just with the absence of footsteps and laughter, but with a deeper, slower silence, the kind that only arrives when a world has finished collapsing, but no one is yet ready to say it aloud. The gardens no longer echoed with flutes. The great halls where Ptolemaic kings and their sister queens, once processed in shimmering linen, now stood undisturbed, shafts of light catching only dust and memory. Egypt had not just lost a queen, it had lost a mirror of itself, a figure who had reflected its strangest and oldest beliefs at it with unwavering calm. And with her final breath, something else died too, the last living thread of the royal sibling tradition that had bound Egypt's throne for more than 3,000 years. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, had no use for sacred marriages or divine unions. He had used it only for taxes, grain, and control. The temples were left to function, at least for a while, and priests were allowed to chant the old names. But they no longer whispered prayers to a living goddess. Cleopatra had been the last. With her death, the performance ended, the curtain fell, and the brother husbands vanished from history, not in battle, not in scandal, but in stillness. No royal pair followed. No divine siblings replaced them. And yet, Rome could not stop talking about them. In the years after Egypt became a Roman province, Cleopatra's image was reshaped into every possible form. An enchantress, a traitor, a goddess, a monster. And at the heart of every version, one detail always returned her marriages to her. Brothers. Roman poets and historians, eager to justify her downfall and elevate their empire, used this detail not as context, but as condemnation. They described it in hushed tones or mocking laughter, making her a symbol of Eastern decadence, of unnatural desire, of female power gone too far. But the truth, as we've seen, was more complicated. Her marriages had not been acts of romance or rebellion. They had been acts of survival, of tradition, of necessity. Still, for Rome, it was easier to reduce than to understand. And thus began one of the strangest legacies in Western imagination. Cleopatra, the queen who married her brothers, became a cultural Rorschach test, a figure through whom every era projected its fears and fantasies. In some eras, she was an icon of forbidden love. In others, a symbol of political cunning. But always, the marriages remained, hanging behind her name like a veil, misinterpreted, misunderstood, and strangely magnetic. As Christianity spread, the view darkened. Church fathers saw in Cleopatra not just a threat to Roman virtue, but to Christian morality. Her unions with her brothers were recast not as relics of an ancient theology, but as sins personal, damning, grotesque. They ignored the millennia of divine justification, the layers of symbolism, the mythic echoes. They saw only the flesh, and they judged. In time, these distorted versions of Cleopatra made their way into European literature, theater, and painting. Renaissance artists, drawn to her tragedy and her allure, painted her draped in pearls, reclining with asps, her brothers absent from the frame, but always implied in the hush. Shakespeare, too, touched on her story, not directly, not with the full weight of her strange history, but with just enough for an audience to feel the sting of scandal. Still, even in these retellings, there were flickers of something deeper, moments where her intelligence, her burden, her poise under impossible demands, broke through the caricatures. But the true story, the one beneath the costumes and condemnation, remained buried, mostly unread, mostly unspoken. And so the world remembered her for her beauty, for her lovers, for her death. But few remembered the rituals. Few recalled the temple doors opening before dawn, to the sound of twin siblings entering hand in hand, their faces still youthful, their roles already heavy. Few imagined the quiet conversations she might have had with her brother husbands, late. At night, voices low, not in seduction, but in strategy, in sorrow, in resignation. Fewer still remembered that these marriages had once been sacred, once rooted in the stars, once praised by entire civilizations who believed that to rule together as siblings was not a corruption, but a cosmic duty. Time has a way of dulling, ritual, of turning theology into taboo. And as the centuries moved on, what had once been divine was now grotesque. Yet Cleopatra did not write her history. Others did that for her. And so the image of the sister wife passed into shadow, a half-truth, whispered louder than the full one. But beneath all of that, beneath the bias and the misreading and the scandal, lies a woman born into a script she didn't choose, who followed it with precision, who outlasted it, and who carried its weight with a quiet that now sounds to us like mystery. As you breathe deeply now, soft in your space, let your thoughts settle on the strange idea that not all silence is forgetfulness. Some silence is protection. Some silence is reverence. Cleopatra's silence, in the end, was not surrender. It was a refusal. She would not defend her marriage. She would not explain them. She left them behind, sealed in her tomb, unspoken. And maybe that's the softest rebellion of all. But her story isn't finished. Not yet. Because while the world moved on, the temples crumbled, and new gods rose, there would still be places where the echo of her ritual lingered, where brother and sister, king and queen, god and goddess were still remembered not as scandal, but as harmony. Harmony. Even after Rome swallowed Egypt whole, even after Cleopatra's tomb was sealed, and her brother husbands forgotten by name, the memory of royal sibling marriage did not vanish entirely. It merely retreated into the quiet corners of ancient texts and temple stones, waiting to be rediscovered not as scandal, but as structure, not as sin, but as reflection. There were still places, long after the last pharaoh had passed, where scribes copied myths of Isis and Osiris, where wall paintings showed the divine embrace of sister and brother, both crowned, both eternal, both glowing with that strange light which flickers between heaven and earth. You see, the tradition of sibling marriage in Egypt had never just been about biology. It had been about cosmology, a careful reenactment of the universe's first harmony. To understand this more deeply, we must pause gently and return once again to the myth at its heart, the story of Osiris and Isis, the brother and sister whose union restored life itself. In the Egyptian mythic cycle, Osiris was the just king, the bringer of civilization, the ruler of order. His brother Set, jealous and violent, dismembered him and scattered his body across the land. But Isis, Osiris's sister and wife, wandered, the earth in mourning, collecting each piece with reverent care. She reassembled him, breathed magic into his form, and conceived a child Horus, who would avenge his father and restore balance to the world. This myth was not meant to be romantic. It was spiritual architecture, a code, a map of life and death and renewal. And it was reenacted endlessly, not just in stories, but in ceremony, in temple rites, in royal marriages. When a pharaoh married his sister, he was not simply following tradition. He was becoming Osiris. She became Isis. Their union was not personal. It was planetary, and it echoed not only in palace halls, but in the very cycles of nature. The Nile's flood, the grain's return, the sun's descent and rise. So when Cleopatra married her brothers, she was stepping into that myth, not as a woman of desire, but as a keeper of order, a participant in the oldest cosmic drama of her civilization. But the Romans did not see that. They knew Osiris only by fragments, Isis only by name, and so they judged what they did not recognize. But even as Rome tried to overwrite the story, Isis refused to disappear. Her cult spread throughout the empire. Temples to her were built in Delos, Pompeii, Gaul, and even London. Roman women prayed to her during childbirth. Sailors carved her name on their ships. In these temples, statues showed her nursing Horus, or holding the Ankh, or wearing the solar disk between cow horn symbols so evocative, so primal, that they would later inspire Christian images of the Madonna and Child. The sacred sister became the sacred mother. Her story lived on, even as the names changed. And in some of these Isis temples, the myth of the divine sibling pair persisted, softened now, spiritualized, removed from royal context, but still echoing that ancient model of balance. Meanwhile, back in Egypt, the old temples slowly fell into disuse. Without living gods to honor, the rites faded. The Nile still rose. The stars still wheeled across the desert sky. But the priests no longer opened the gates at dawn to welcome the divine siblings. Their voices stilled, their scrolls stored away, forgotten in chambered walls buried beneath silt and time. Yet not all was lost. In the centuries to come, explorers, scholars, and dreamers would return. They would brush away the dust, trace the hieroglyphs, translate the myths, and begin to understand not just the beauty, but the structure, the logic of it. They would see, carved into stone reliefs from Karnak and Philae and Edfu, the repeated image, brother and sister ruling side by side, each with a crown, each with a role, each a half of the world. And slowly, carefully, the judgment would soften. What had once been dismissed as decadence would begin to be studied as theology. What had been mocked would be reclassified as cosmology. And somewhere along that path, Cleopatra's story would be re-examined, not as an anomaly, not as a scandal, but as the last chapter in a long and hauntingly symmetrical book. Her marriages, strange to modern eyes, were not deviations, they were fulfillments. They were the final enactments of a story that had begun long before her, with stars and floods and gods made whole through union. And though she died at the hands of Rome's ambition, her participation in that ancient trauma gave her a place not only in history, but in myth. Even today, when we speak her name, we do so with a certain hush. It is not just her beauty we remember, or her politics, or her tragic end. It is her gravity, her stillness, her able to wear the mask of a goddess while still carrying the burden of a mortal. As you lie in stillness now, your breath slow and steady, perhaps you can feel the edge of that burden, the quiet pressure of a tradition so vast, so old, that it leaves no room for choice, only performance. Cleopatra did not invent the script. She read it aloud, perfectly, and then she closed the book. But what happened to the world that still needed that book? To the people who remembered the divine sibling marriage, not with judgment, but with longing? As we drift forward, let's listen to the echo, not from the palaces of Egypt, but from the hearts of those who mourned the silence that followed. The silence that followed. Cleopatra's death was not just the silence of tombs in broken dynasties. was the silence of a world whose core ritual had ended without ceremony, without replacement, without acknowledgement that something immense had quietly slipped away. In the generations that followed, Egypt remained Egypt in name, but not in essence. The temples still stood for a time, their columns sunlit and vast, but the prayers inside no longer summoned the same divinity. The royal line was broken, the blood that had once justified the sacred marriage scattered, diluted, erased. The memory of brother and sister ruling as one, mirroring Isis and Osiris in human form, was now something that lingered only in stone and story, no longer embodied in breath and ritual. And yet, even without a pharaoh to enact it, the myth persisted. In the furthest villages, during certain festivals, elderly women would tell the story of the goddess who mourned her brother husband, who traveled the land gathering the pieces of his broken body, who brought life back to death through her love and magic. These stories, whispered to children under oil lamps or sung in rhythm to the pounding of bread dough, retained their warmth. They were not tales of scandal. They were tales of order, of loss, of endurance. Meanwhile, the Roman Empire, oblivious to what it had severed, carried forward its legacy cold, military, and administrative. It did not need divine siblings. Its gods were distant, competitive, mortal-like in their flaws. And as Christianity spread through its provinces and replaced not just statues, but symbols, the idea of marrying a sibling moved from sacred to sinful. Incest, once divine imitation, was now described as a crime against nature, a fall from grace. But culture is rarely so linear. In the deep folds of early Christian art, some old shapes remained. The Madonna holding the child Horus became the Virgin with Jesus. The goddess Isis, nursing her so, became Mary at Bethlehem. And in this strange transmutation, the echo of divine family persisted, but filtered, softened, made acceptable to new theology. The brother-husband vanished, but the mother-child remained. It was safer, less challenging, yet still faintly haunted by the memory of a more complex divine pairing. Across the centuries, scholars occasionally stumbled across the old Egyptian patterns. Some dismissed them as grotesque. Others, quietly fascinated, began to study the structure behind the symbolism. Why had Egypt insisted, for millennia, that siblings rule together? Why had the divine union been so central, so enduring, so carefully preserved across dynasties and invasions? The answer, slowly and softly, revealed itself. Because the Egyptians were obsessed not with dominance, but with balance. Their entire worldview hinged on the principle of order, harmony, justice, and balance. And in their mythology, no pair better represented balance than Isis and Osiris. Not a husband and wife chosen from different families, not strangers united for treaties, but two beings born of the same celestial material. Twin flames, cosmic reflections. To marry a sibling in that system was not to indulge in desire, it was to reinforce the structure of the universe. And when a pharaoh mirrored that divine pairing, he was saying, "My rule is not random. It is the continuation of cosmic truth." Cleopatra, born into the long arc of that system, could not escape it. Even if she saw its flaws, even if she felt the sorrow at its center, she had to perform that, because without that performance, the illusion would crack, and with it, the very claim to rule. So she stood beside her brother husbands, not out of romance, but out of necessity. She crowned them, co-ruled with them, and buried them when they became inconvenient. Each time she took on the full weight of their divine pairing, because someone had to. But what did that do to her? What does it do to a person to live so fully within a role that the self disappears? Perhaps Cleopatra did not have an answer. Perhaps she never asked the question. Or perhaps, in her final moments, she did. Perhaps That's why she chose not to be captured, not to be paraded, not to be remembered as a Roman subject. She had played the goddess long enough, and when the gods fell silent, she let herself vanish with them. Yet the world could not let her go. Let her go. Not truly. In medieval alchemical texts, Cleopatra appears again, this time as a mystic, a magician, a keeper of secrets. In Renaissance poetry, she re-emerges as a tragic heroine. In Enlightenment histories, she is dissected, analyzed, and reduced. And in modern cinema, she becomes spectacle again draped in gold, wrapped in desire, whispered about as if her story was only ever about seduction. But beneath all that, the real Cleopatra waits, patient, layered, not just the woman who married her brothers, but the queen who inherited a system so old it no longer remembered how to question itself. The woman who stood in the last shaft of sunlight between gods and men, between ritual and reason, between Egypt and everything. That would come after. As you drift now, breathe low and steady. Perhaps you can feel the dust of her world settle softly around you. The cool stone of temple corridors, the scent of myrrh rising in the morning, the distant beat of drums echoing through an open courtyard, where a brother and sister once took vows neither of them could refuse. But this is not the end. There is still more to uncover. Not in the palaces, but in the ruins. Not in the scrolls, but in the spaces between them. Let us go there next, gently, while the past is still listening. There are ruins where the wind still sings the names of rulers long reduced to dust, where cracked columns lean in the desert like tired shoulders, and in those ruins often untouched by tourists, sometimes unnamed by maps, the memory of the sibling throne still lingers like a scent you can't place, but never forget. They are not marked with signs. No guide explains them with bright gestures. And yet, when you step near, when the shadows fall just right across a fragment of inscription, you realize that someone once stood in this exact place wearing both crown and burden, not alone, but beside a sibling whose name was both family and function. In these ruins, archaeologists have found the smallest things: broken amulets bearing twin cartouches, floor mosaics with mirrored thrones, fragments of offering tables where two royal figures face each other, hand outstretched, holding the eternal Ankh of life. These were not artistic choices, they were theological blueprints. Every detail of ancient Egyptian royal design echoed the belief that harmony could only be achieved through a mirrored pair, male and female, sun and moon, Osiris and Isis, king and queen, brother and sister. And while later cultures would wrinkle their noses at such pairings, Egypt saw no perversity in the pattern. It saw rhythm, a rhythm so old it felt inevitable. That rhythm extended even beyond the royal marriage. It shaped how Egypt wrote its myths, structured its rituals, and carved its gods. For example, the Book of the Dead, an ancient funerary text, doesn't just describe judgment in the afterlife. It is filled with duets, two figures weighing a heart, two guardians beside a gate, two truths needing balance. Always two, always paired. To rule alone in such a culture would be to walk with one foot. And so the pharaoh and his sister wife moved in tandem, even if one carried more power, even if the other died young. This is the world Cleopatra was born into, not a world of choice, but of choreographed necessity. She may have read Homer, studied astronomy, spoken Latin and Aramaic and Egyptian, but none of her education gave her an escape route. The ritual was written long before her, and the only way to wear the crown was to accept the script. But over time, you can almost feel her begin to rewrite it, not openly, not rebelliously, but like someone editing the inside of a wall she's still pretending to support. Her marriages to her brothers were shorter than her rule. Her real partnerships, Caesar Antony existed outside the sibling tradition, and yet she never denounced the old form. She honored it just enough to keep the illusion intact. And perhaps that was her genius. She preserved the structure while hollowing it out, replacing ritual with strategy, divine symmetry with political survival. Her brother husbands died young, perhaps conveniently. Her children became symbols. Her lovers became allies. Her throne, once shared, became solitary. And yet, she still called herself Isis. She still commissioned reliefs where she stood beside figures who had already vanished. She understood the power of the image, even if the truth beneath it had changed. This strange duality living both within and beyond the tradition is what makes Cleopatra so difficult to define. She was not the last gasp of ancient Egypt. She was in her final performance, the last high priestess of a worldview that had outlived its faith. She knew the notes, and she sang them beautifully. But the audience had changed. The world had changed. And in that mismatch between ceremony and reality, something broke, but it broke quietly. Even today, scholars debate whether Cleopatra believed in the old gods or simply used them, whether she loved her brother husbands or merely tolerated them, whether she saw herself as divine or just acted the part. But perhaps those are the wrong questions. Perhaps the better question is, what does it do to a person to be the final speaker of a dying language? To carry, alone, the burden of 1,000 years of ritual, knowing that each time she steps into a temple or dons a crown beside a brother, she is not reviving something, but preserving its echo? It is a heavy silence, and she bore it with more grace than history has often granted her. After her death, the Romans tried to fill that silence with noise, with stories of seduction, betrayal, spectacle. But none of it could replace the sacred symmetry she represented. And so her story lingered, half remembered, half rejected. In medieval monasteries, monks recopied Roman histories without realizing they were also preserving fragments of Egyptian theology. In Renaissance courts, Cleopatra became muse and monster in equal measure. But in every painting, every poem, every sliver of cinema that bore her name, the shadow of her brother husbands remained unspoken, but present. A detail too strange to erase, too powerful to explain. And so we arrive here, centuries later, still trying to make sense of it all, still whispering her name as if it means something more than just one woman, still drawn not just to her beauty or her politics or her death, but to the strange structure she embodied. A structure in which family and fate were the same, in which power was shared not with strangers, but with mirrors. As you breathe now, deeply and calmly, perhaps you can feel that structure settling around you, not as judgment, but as curiosity. What would it mean to live in a world where every role was assigned before birth, where love and lineage were inseparable, where every choice echoed a myth you didn't write, but still had to perform? The answer, like Cleopatra's gaze from the carvings, remains open. But there is still more to uncover, because long after the rituals stopped, the symbols remained, and in them, the old world still speaks softly, but clearly. Even centuries after Cleopatra's tomb had vanished beneath layers of Nile silt and imperial conquest, and even as her name echoed more often through myth than memory, the architecture of her world, the actual symbolic logic behind her marriages to her brothers, still lingered beneath the surface of scholarship and imagination, like a buried chamber just beneath our feet, humming quietly in the dark. It is easy now, in modern minds, to reduce her unions to scandal, to view them through the fogged lens of taboo, forgetting that in her own time, in her land, and for most of the dynasties that preceded her, such a marriage was not just normal. It was sacred. But how do we recover that understanding in a world that no longer believes the sun is divine, that sees the moon as a rock, that no longer kneels before the rising flood of a river and thanks it with hymns? The key is not in judgment, but in reconstruction. A careful, soft uncovering of how the ancient Egyptians thought the world was built. In their eyes, the universe was not chaotic, but beautifully balanced, a mirror of opposites in perfect harmony. Night complemented day, male needed female, earth touched sky. Everything that was broken longed to be whole again. And at the center of this worldview were pairs, not just lovers, but cosmic siblings. The most powerful gods were often twins in nature, reflections of each other across the boundaries of gender and domain. Geb and Nut, Shu and Tefnut, and most importantly, Isis and Osiris, the sacred brother and sister whose union restored life after death, whose shared love gave birth to the Avenger Horus, and whose story taught the Egyptians that resurrection required reunion. This was not a myth in the casual sense. It was a reality rendered symbolic. And so, for 3,000 years, Egyptian monarchs patterned their lives upon it. To be Pharaoh was to be Horus made flesh, and to marry one's sister was not a matter of attraction or personal longing, but a ritual reenactment of divine balance, the ruler aligning himself with cosmic rhythm by creating on earth what the gods modeled in the heavens. Cleopatra, born into this world at its very twilight, did not invent the tradition, she simply upheld it. And when she married her brother Ptolemy the 13th, and then later Ptolemy the 14th, she was not enacting a personal choice, but fulfilling a requirement. The throne demanded symmetry. The crown had always sat best upon heads that were both kin and king, and king. And yet, and this is where the story begins to crack open into something more human. Cleopatra's Egypt was no longer the Egypt of pyramids and gods and unchallenged rights. It was an Egypt of scrolls and strategy, of Greek influence, of Roman attention. She lived not in an untouched mythic world, but in a liminal moment, a hinge between empires. And though the temples still functioned, and the priests still chanted, the people had changed. The very act of marrying a brother no longer held the unchallenged holiness it once did. Greek customs frowned upon it. Roman culture considered it perverse. And so Cleopatra, walking daily through the contradiction of ruling both an ancient kingdom and a hybrid, colonized, hyper-visible territory, had to perform a near-impossible balancing act. She could not undo the sacred rites, for they were the last pillar of her divine legitimacy. But she also could not rely on them to protect her. The very rituals that once confirmed her as Isis incarnate now made her a target for foreign propaganda. And so, while she stood in ceremonies beside her brother husbands, while she conducted the rites, signed the decrees, sat beside them on thrones carved with lotus and papyrus, she did something quietly radical. She hollowed the ritual from the inside. She kept its shape, but not its spirit. The marriages became formalities. Power did not flow through them. Her true alliances, political, emotional, dynastic, lay elsewhere. With Caesar, with Antony, with her son, Caesarion. And in doing so, Cleopatra did something that may be the most subtle transformation of all. She took a ritual that had once been divine, that had once guided the stars and the soil and the Nile, and turned it into pure symbolism, a performance for optics, not for gods. And yet, she never destroyed the ritual outright. She understood, perhaps more than anyone before her, that rituals do not end with violence. They end with neglect, with silence, with time. So she let the sacred sibling marriage fade softly, like a candle allowed to burn out, naturally, rather, than blown out mid-prayer. When her final brother-husband died, under circumstances still debated by historians, there was no grand funeral, no cosmic reckoning, no twin enthronement to follow. She simply moved on, and Egypt quietly moved with her. In this gesture, this soft, nearly invisible shift, Cleopatra closed the door on one of the most extraordinary social architectures ever designed by humans. A system in which the divine was not prayed to, but performed. In which blood was not just inheritance, but theology. In which marriage was not personal, but planetary. And when she closed that door, she did not write an explanation. She offered no defense. She simply disappeared into the folds of history, taking with her the last living example of a world where siblinghood was the highest form of kingship. And now, as you lie still, eyes heavy, body calm, you might find yourself wondering, if Cleopatra had lived just one generation later, would she have told her story differently? Would she have confessed the weight of it? Or would she have continued to keep her silence, trusting that time, not words, would make sense of what she had carried? The answers are not written. But the next part of the story waits, not in the palaces, not even in the tombs, but in what Rome did with her memory next. After Cleopatra died, Rome did not just bury her kingdom, it rewrote her. Not in stone, as the Egyptians once did, but in paper and rumor and marble busts sculpted by men who had never seen her, only feared what she had represented. Not just a queen, not just a woman, but the last living symbol of a divine logic that the empire could not assimilate. For the Romans, who prized law over myth and conquest over ritual, Cleopatra's world was too fluid, too ritualized, too filled with contradictions. Gods that were siblings, queens who were priestesses, marriages that looked like politics, but sounded like theology. To understand what happened next, you must imagine a long table in a shaded Roman villa, where senators whispered and poets sharpened their pens, reshaping her into something more digestible, more villainous, more seductive. The sibling marriages, above all, became the centerpiece of their scorn, not as historical realities, but as dramatic material. Writers like Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and later poets latched onto those unions not as facts to be explored, but as evidence of corruption, decadence, and moral decay. They presented Cleopatra not as the inheritor of millennia-old divine traditions, but as a woman who twisted family bonds for power, as if she had created the system herself. They omitted the centuries of precedent, the theological scaffolding, the sacred cosmology. They gave her no context, only judgment. And thus was born the version of Cleopatra that would persist for generations. A temptress queen, a lover of powerful men, a breaker of empires, a woman who slept with her brothers not because she had to, but because she wanted to. It was a distortion so complete that few even questioned it. And it worked, in part, because it allowed the Romans to wash their hands of what they had destroyed. By framing Egypt as corrupt, they could justify its conquest. By making Cleopatra exotic, they could make her disposable. And yet, the real Cleopatra refused to die. Her image evolved, quietly, hidden beneath the Roman caricature. In parts of the empire, especially where Isis worship persisted along the coasts, in trade cities, among women and sailors, Cleopatra remained a symbol not of seduction, but of sorrow. The last priestess of a fading order. The last queen who stood between ritual and ruin. And in those places, stories began to circulate not of her lovers, but of her lineage. Of the burden she had carried. Of the marriages she had enacted without desire. And though these stories never reached the level of official history, they survived in fragments, in temple graffiti, in half-legible papyrus, in the naming of daughters who bore her likeness in statues long since buried. Meanwhile, back in Rome, the Senate passed over her son, Caesarion, executing him to sever any claim to divine lineage. No child of a goddess queen and a Roman dictator would threaten Augustus. The Ptolemaic line ended in silence, but the Roman obsession with her never did. Over time, Cleopatra became a theater, Renaissance dramatists revived her with sighs, daggers. Enlightenment historians dissected her with cold detachment. In every age, she was made again. Sometimes soft, sometimes monstrous, always other. And in nearly every retelling, the detail returned. She married her brothers. Even as the rest of her story blurred, that single fact remained sharp, uncomfortable, unforgettable. But very few paused to ask, what did that marriage mean to her? To her people? To her gods? It is easy to call something strange. It is harder to understand why it made sense for so long. For the Egyptians, sibling marriage among rulers was never about desire. It was about structure. The pharaoh and his sister were seen as two halves of one celestial identity. Their union, symbolic or real, was not private. It was national, cosmic. To undo it would be to risk disorder, not just politically, but cosmologically. So Cleopatra, inheriting the last threads of this vast design, followed the path laid before her, even as the world changed beneath her feet. She stood in ceremonies with her brothers. She enacted rituals that once brought order to the land. And then, gently, she let them end. But Rome didn't see that part. Rome saw only the surface. And so, for centuries, the idea of Cleopatra became a hall of mirrors. Every culture found something different in her reflection. To some, she was a mystic. To others, a manipulator. But rarely was she seen for what she most likely was. A woman raised inside a theology that demanded she be more than herself. A woman who wore crowns and family titles and divine expectations all at once. A woman who, from her first breath, had been cast in a role that came with rules older than language. And so, as you rest now, your breath softening with the weight of history's quiet corners, you might begin to understand why her marriages were not footnotes or gossip. They were architecture. They were the framework into which she was born. And like any architecture, they shaped the way she moved, stood, reigned, and eventually fell. But even in collapse, the shape remained. And today, in temples where sand fills the stairs and pigeons roost, where priests once chanted, her name still curls across the stone Cleopatra Philopater, goddess of her father, queen of the two lands paired, always with the cartouche of a brother who ruled beside her, even if only in name. Shall we step into those ruins next, where the wind still knows her name, and where the walls still remember the sound of her sandals on the polished floor? If you walk today through the fallen temples of Dendera, Philae, or Edfu, where the sun burns against centuries of stillness, and the hieroglyphs remain carved with fingers long turned to dust, you may still find, on the rear walls and inside, dim corridors, twin figures standing side by side, man and woman, crown and serpent, often bearing names like Ptolemy and Cleopatra, though not always the ones we know. These pairs stare forward eternally, frozen in divine stillness, and if you didn't know the history, you might think they were lovers. But they were more than that, and less. They were brother and sister, god and goddess, mirror and mirror maid, to rule together, not out of affection, but out of architecture. You see, in the Egyptian worldview, to be royal was not a role. It was a reenactment of a cosmic story. And that story did not involve freedom. It involved balance. Just as the sun must rise and the Nile must flood, so too must the throne be, held by a pair that reflected the sacred twinship of Isis and Osiris. By the time of Cleopatra, the seventh, the one whose name has endured beyond dust and empire, this tradition was so old it felt like bedrock. And even though Rome saw it as deviant, and modern minds flinch at the very thought, it had a logic that made sense to its people. If the world had once been perfected by a union between sacred siblings, then to repeat that union on earth was to keep perfection alive. Cleopatra, born into this twilight logic, did not challenge it, not openly, She married her brothers because the throne demanded it. She stood beside them in ceremonies. She issued joint decrees. She invoked the twin gods as though they were watching. And then, when the world began to shift, when Rome arrived not with understanding, but with blades, she quietly changed the meaning of the ritual. She allowed the brother marriages to become hollow, ceremonial, names on scrolls, faces on coins. Not power in the room. Her true alliances lived elsewhere. But still, even as she leaned into her relationships with Caesar and Antony, even as she redefined her dynasty through her children, she never quite let go of the form. In temple reliefs, she is still depicted as Isis, flanked by a consort. In festivals, her name is still sung with the divine twins, because the people needed the form, and perhaps she did too. There is something about structure, about keeping the frame even when the picture changes, that allows transitions to happen without collapse. But once she was gone, the frame did collapse. No one ruled after her in the name of divine siblinghood. No queens married their brothers in the name of balance. The sacred marriage vanished, not with rebellion, not with outcry, but with disuse. And yet, the symbols remained. In walls and scrolls and tiny golden amulets, brother and sister still stand together, offering the Ankh to the gods. For a long time, historians looked at this with confusion. They labeled it primitive, grotesque, even evil. But now, slowly, that view is changing. Not into approval, but into understanding. Ritual sibling marriage in ancient Egypt was not about affection or genetics. It was about cosmological repair. The world had once been broken, Osiris dismembered, the flood disturbed, and only a sister's devotion could gather the pieces and make the world whole again. To reenact that myth in royal life was not indulgence. It was maintenance. It was hope. Cleopatra inherited this hope and carried it, even when the faith behind it had started to wane. She married her brothers not to possess them, but to protect the illusion that Egypt was still whole. Her story is, in many ways, a story about the last person holding up a collapsing ceiling. She stood in the temple doorway, smiling, raising, her hands reciting the prayers, even as cracks ran through the walls and dust settled where dancers once moved. She was not pretending. It was just that she understood something most people forget. Rituals matter even when belief fades. They hold shape. They give time meaning. They allow endings to arrive with grace instead of chaos. And so she ended. It all softly. No declarations. No abolition of sibling marriage. Just silence. Just succession. Just history taking over. Today, if we remember Cleopatra only as a woman who seduced emperors, we miss the deeper truth that she was the final note in a song that began before the pyramids were built. She didn't compose it. She sang it well. And when the music began to fade, she let it fade. And now, as you breathe slowly, your room is dim, and your thoughts are drifting into half-light. You might wonder what it would feel like to be the last living carrier of a cosmic ritual, knowing that after you, the line ends. Would you mourn? Or would you exhale? Cleopatra, perhaps, did both. But her silence speaks volumes. And in that silence, her brother husbands are not monsters or footnotes. They are chapters in a book the world no longer reads, but once believed could keep the sky from falling. There is something almost impossible to name that lingers in the wake of a long tradition's final breath. Not grief exactly, not nostalgia, but a kind of atmospheric weight, like a scent or echo that you can't quite find the source of. When Cleopatra died in her sealed chamber, the world lost more than a queen. It lost the last conscious embodiment of an ancient cosmology that had been walked, spoken, and believed for over 3,000 years. A system where time was circular, where the divine was visible, and where marriage was not about love, but about reenacting balance between opposing cosmic forces. She had performed her part, standing beside two brothers in her life, first Ptolemy the 13th, then Ptolemy the 14th, both younger, both more symbolic than sovereign, both folded into the mythic roles they were expected to play. Whether she grieved them, feared them, manipulated them, or all three, history cannot say for sure. But what is certain is that she married them because the throne required it. The gods demanded symmetry, and a Ptolemaic queen without a royal consort was not a goddess, not a ruler, not a true pharaoh. She was only a woman, and Cleopatra was never only anything. So she played the part. She lit the incense. She wore the vulture crown. She sat on the gilded throne carved with lotus stems and celestial oars and allowed the people to believe, one final time, that Egypt was still whole. But in truth, the fractures had already formed. The Nile still rose. The temples still stood. The priests still recited the litanies. But Rome was watching, and Rome did not believe in Osiris. The rituals of the sibling throne, once so vivid, so unquestioned, now belonged to a fading world. Cleopatra saw that. Perhaps that's why she shifted so quietly toward the future. Her son Caesarion, declared co-ruler after her final brothers. Beth represented more than a dynastic continuation. He was a synthesis, a child of Greek lineage and Egyptian ritual, of Roman blood and Eastern divinity. In him, she placed her final hope. Not for love, not for empire, but for continuity. But continuity is not something one person can carry forever. Caesarion was executed by order of Octavian soon after Cleopatra's death, and with him, the last trace of the sacred marriage vanished. Rome moved in. Egypt became a province. The temples were slowly emptied. The gods stopped speaking. And the walls, once echoing with chants about twin gods and the sacred pair, grew still. And yet, despite Rome's conquest, despite the smear campaigns, despite the erasure of so much of her nuance, Cleopatra's legacy endured, strange, luminous, refracted. In time, she was remembered more for her relationships with Caesar and Antony than for her marriages to her brothers. But in those deeper chambers of the past, in the quieter stones and overlooked inscriptions, the older story still waits. The one where she is not a lover, but a high priestess of the sibling throne. The one where her marriages were not personal betrayals or perversions, but acts of sacred preservation, rituals carried out not with joy, perhaps, but with steady purpose, so that the old structure would not fall all at once. And even now, when modern eyes glance back and stumble upon the phrase, Cleopatra married her brothers, there is often discomfort, confusion, and dismissal. But maybe, now, having walked slowly with her through her temples and thrones and final shadows, you can feel something different. Not scandal, but structure. Not desire, but design. Her story was never about pleasure. It was about weight. About responsibility, about being the last person standing inside a ritual framework so ancient it no longer remembers how to bend. And so, she didn't break it. She carried it. And when the time came, she set it down without ceremony, like a priest, who extinguishes the last lamp, not because the light is no longer needed, but because the morning has come. Her brother husbands are gone, their names blurred, their statues cracked. But for centuries, they ruled together with her not as partners of the heart, but as halves of a cosmic story that began before writing and ended in a Roman whisper. As you breathe deeply now, your body warm in stillness, your mind soft, you may begin to understand that some traditions are not meant to last, but they are meant to be remembered, not repeated, but understood. Cleopatra's marriages were strange, yes, but they were never random. They were the final performances in a theater, older than memory, carried out by a woman who knew the audience was leaving, but bowed anyway. She gave the story its final form, and then she left the stage. The stage. And perhaps, in that exit, there is something sacred too. So the next time you hear her name, or see her painted in gold, remember not just the lovers or the war or the poison in figs. Remember the silence, the temple before dawn. The crown was shared with a brother, not because of love, but because the stars had once said it must be so. That story is finished now, but another waits, somewhere deeper in the dark, where old traditions sleep beside the gods they served, still whispering if you know how to listen. By the time the last echo of Cleopatra's voice had faded from the high halls of Alexandria, and the sea winds had swept across her city without calling her name, what remained was not just a legacy carved in gold, or a tragedy whispered in foreign tongues. It was a question that history kept circling. Why had she married her brothers? And beneath that, a more ancient question still, why had so many before her done the same? To answer it fully, one has to go deeper than dates and dynasties. One has to leave behind the columns and capitals and walk quietly into the shadowy spaces where ritual becomes identity and symbolism replaces logic. In Egypt, the royal sibling marriage was not just political or theological, it was mnemonic, a form of remembering, an act of retelling. Every union between a pharaoh and his sister was a miniature reenactment of the world's beginning, of the sacred story where chaos was defeated not by war, but by reunification. Osiris dismembered, Isis grieving, the body found, the balance restored. And in a land where myth was not separate from administration, where priests kept calendars by the stars and farmers planted according to divine moods, that reenactment wasn't optional. It was what kept the fields growing and the sky spinning. Cleopatra, born into this system at its final breath, carried more than titles when she wed her brothers. She carried continuity. But the continuity was cracking. Rome had no room for cosmic siblings. The empire, practical and suspicious of softness, saw only incest where once there had been restoration. But Egypt had always lived differently. Its deepest truths were sung, not shouted, whispered, not argued. And so, even as Rome laughed or recoiled at the Ptolemaic model, Egypt itself held quiet. The people did not riot when Cleopatra married Ptolemy XIII. The priests did not protest when she was later joined to Ptolemy XIV. It was expected. It was inevitable. But even inevitability has a shelf life. As the ceremonies continued, their sacred weight began to thin. What had once been a shared rulership gradually became a symbolic alignment. Her brother husbands faded, one drowned in the Nile after civil war. Another died mysteriously, young and unremarked. Cleopatra mourned them as required, perhaps even sincerely, but their absence did not collapse the system. She simply adapted. When Caesar arrived, she formed a new kind of union, not divine twinship, but geopolitical partnership. And when Antony entered her life, she performed yet another kind of alignment, east and west, goddess and general, old and new. The brother-husband role, once central, became a ceremonial background, yet it never fully disappeared. In the coinage, the inscriptions, the public documents, the idea remained that the queen ruled alongside a male counterpart from her own house, keeping the circle unbroken. But in truth, the circle had already frayed, and Cleopatra knew it. Perhaps that's why her later years were marked, not by more ritual marriages, but by the attempt to reframe succession entirely. Caesarion was not her brother. He was her son. The dynasty would not continue through symbolic twinship, but through blood and power, born of empire and foreign alignment. And still she kept the rituals alive, if only faintly, like someone humming a lullaby from childhood. Not because it means what it once did, but because it keeps the silence from getting too loud. In the deep temple spaces, rituals, were still offered in pairs. Incense was still burned for the twin thrones. And in the minds of her subjects, the myth was not yet dead. It had merely gone underground. After her death, as Roman culture painted over the frescoes and filled in the names with Latin, some of those temple spaces were abandoned. Others were converted. But the memory of the divine sibling never fully faded. In the deserts, in the libraries, in the oral traditions of the southern priesthoods, people remembered. They whispered that once there had been a balance, that once the gods had walked as siblings, and the land had flourished under their gaze, that Cleopatra had kept that gaze alive even when it scorched her. She had done what the gods had done. She had married her brother, not out of choice, not out of love, but out of the demand to be divine in a world that had forgotten what divinity costs. Her story, in this light, is not one of scandal, it is one of inheritance. A girl born into a script so old that even the ink had started to fade, but she kept reading anyway. And perhaps that's what makes her so haunting. Not that she broke rules, but that she followed ones most of us have never heard of. As you lie here now, breathing soft, letting the story curl like smoke around the edges of your thoughts, you may feel that quiet weight, the pressure of ancient performance, of roles too large for the body that must wear them. Cleopatra wore. Hers well. She stepped into the role of goddess, sister wife, queen, strategist, survivor. And she carried each name with poise, knowing that one day all of them would be misunderstood. But she did not flinch. And now, so far from her time, so far from her Nile and her temples and her brother thrones, we look back and see only outlines her image and profile, the cartouche carved beside another. But beneath those lines, there was a woman who understood exactly what she was upholding, and exactly what would happen when she could uphold it no longer. One final part remains. The ritual is almost done. Let us walk softly to its closing. And so we come to the end, not just of Cleopatra's story, not just of the Ptolemies, but of an entire worldview that once pulsed beneath the sun like a sacred river, twisting and flowing through rituals, names, crowns, and silences that spoke louder than war. It ended not with a sword, but with a question hanging in the air like the last note of a song. Was it ever understood, or only watched from afar? As the world turned, as Rome absorbed Egypt, as Latin erased Demotic, and the eagle replaced the vulture and the temple doors swung shut for the last time, what survived was not the gold or the thrones, or the twin rule of brother and sister. It was the story, flickering in the dark. Cleopatra, the last queen, became myth not because of her romance or her riches, but because she was the final one willing to perform an old truth that no longer had believers. Her marriages to her brothers were never personal. They were national. They were liturgies. And like all sacred duties at the end of their era, they became heavier with each passing year. Her brother Ptolemies, so often overshadowed by Caesar and Antony in the stories we read today, were her original co-stars in the oldest theater of divine power, where the siblings did not need to love or even like each other. They only needed to stand, to reflect, to preserve the illusion that Egypt still held the center of the cosmos. When those brothers died, so too did the ceremony. And yet Cleopatra continued, adjusting her performance, folding the old rites into the new, never denying the past, only reshaping it to survive. Some say this was clever politics. Others say it was devotion, but perhaps it was neither. Perhaps it was simply what had to be done. When the gods fall silent, when the people no longer understand the rituals that once defined the rising of the sun and the flooding of the Nile, there must still be someone who lights the incense, who speaks the names, who places the crown just so. Cleopatra did that. And when the time came, she ended it herself, not with an army, but with a whisper. She was buried, perhaps with Antony, Perhaps not. Her tomb is lost. The last queen of the last dynasty that married its brothers and sisters like the gods. The last woman to wear the double crown and call herself both pharaoh and mother, wife and goddess, vanished into history not as a figure of scandal, but as a figure of completion. The ritual could not be passed down. There was no one left to take it. Caesarion was killed. The temple records ended. The language changed. The silence began. But her name remained. In coins, in paintings, in the flickering torchlight of myths. Retold by men who never saw her, but needed to describe her. Some made her evil. Some made her irresistible. Some erased her. But in the quietest corners of old Egypt, where the walls still carry the names of Osiris and Isis, where the hieroglyphs haven't been worn smooth by time, you may still find her Cleopatra, holding a sistrum, standing beside a figure labeled, not Caesar, not Antony, but Ptolemy her brother, her mirror, her ritual anchor. For thousands of years, such pairings had ruled with the confidence of divine order. In Cleopatra's time, that confidence was cracked, but she kept it alive just long enough for the sun to set gently, not crash. And now, you, lying still beneath blankets while the world outside goes quiet, may begin to feel the ancient rhythm she once protected, the soft pulse of ceremony, the gentle turning of meaning across generations, the sacred fatigue of someone who knows the performance is ending, but still speaks the final line with care. Perhaps Cleopatra was not the last queen, but the last oracle, the last high priestess of a system that no longer had worshippers. Her marriages, so strange to us now, were not errors. They were verses in a liturgy older than time. And when the liturgy ended, she closed the book with steady hands. Not bitter, not broken, just done. So rest now, knowing you have heard something. Few do not the loud story of Cleopatra the seductress, but the quiet one of Cleopatra the keeper, the woman who married her brothers, so that the world, however briefly, would remember how balance once felt. The ritual is complete, the temple is dark, but the story has been told, and somewhere in the hush of your thoughts, it will echo like footsteps on stone. Listen, if you like, or sleep. The goddess has left the stage. The river flows on.